Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this hybrid Pogo session. Today we have been hosting in Oxford the very first SPARKS Net Zero Targets in Government Contracting Symposium of 2024. And so what we're hoping to do in this session is draw out some of the learning from our workshop today. So the question we've been addressing in very broad terms is how will we compare and improve green public procurement and carbon net zero policy implementation at different levels of government around the world. And we've had some different sessions through the day focusing on what do we mean by net zero and how do we translate the idea of net zero into actual activities and targets for contractors to potentially achieve. We've been thinking about different mechanisms within the procurement process for doing that, different stages of the contracting process. We've been thinking about the data that we need to assemble and clean up and work with in order to make those kinds of comparisons. And we've been thinking about the capacity of procurement officials to develop these kinds of green procurement policies and apply them in their day-to-day work, alongside everything else that they're being expected to do. So we've had a really rich and full day, and we're going to hear from some different participants in the day who I've asked to pick out something that struck them from the day, what they learned from it, what they think is most important, what they wanted to highlight from the very full discussion that we've had. So as always, our time is short. And so we will plow on through without formalities and introductions. So Andre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. It's a great opportunity to be here. Nice to meet you all online. Well, this workshop brought to me very interesting points. I would like to start saying that the comparative approach may bring us some difficulties because we have different levels of preparedness and awareness from our countries regarding net zero policies, including the capacity of procurement teams. In the last section, what made me think more was related to the level of professionalism we may have in many countries regarding the procurement role and procurement officials, etc. And what we'd like to bring again here to our online audience is the role of auditing bodies. I would like to insist on this, the role of auditing bodies in some countries, mainly in countries in which often the national level adopts a top-down and compulsory approach to implement change. Then we there talked about there is a culture shift in place. Then if we adopt a compulsory top-down to implement the procurement, green procurement, we may face greenwashing or other strategies that governments adopt just to comply with auditing bodies. Then I think I stop here for now, and then maybe
we'll hear again then.
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Andy, a couple of thoughts from you.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, Andre, the paradigm shift that's required, and that was very much in what we're talking about today, in various different ways, really, is that we can't really keep doing what we've always done. We need to do something different. We need to push out and move the envelope, push the envelope rather, and because targets that have to be achieved are massive. And the question is how much can public procurement contribute to that? In Ireland, where I'm a practitioner, we heavily use the European GPP criteria, and it's very helpful in actually greening our procurement, and it's got a huge degree of authenticity to it. A whole lot of work went into developing that. But the question I have, and it came out really in the symposium this afternoon, is like linking that to actual emissions and how are we contributing to the actual emission reductions in our activities. And that's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. It's difficult with data. You mentioned greenwashing yourself as well. There's a lot of different things that are challenging on that, but it's not a reason to do nothing by any stretch of the imagination. Good work can be done in that area, but we just need to think differently. And another thing that didn't really come out in the session, but praise on my mind, is like we tended to go green in goods rather than services, and the services is an area which is very difficult to navigate in terms of it's not, even when you're talking about procurement, everybody talks about widgets, and a lot of the kind of research from procurement come from car manufacturing. So it's using material out around doesn't really work very well for the actual services, which is the biggest spend of, I know from the Irish government, but I would say world government, it's all going into services. And then you have the hidden services of cloud, etc., which is guzzling up huge resources, and we don't even know we're using it half the time. So yeah, I don't know if that. Another thing I mentioned myself was the circular economy as well. A number of them mentioned that, and I would say the focus can be a lot on the recycle end of it, but really, if you look at all the different layers, and the model I particularly like is the 7 hours model, it's favored by the Dutch. But you're looking at the top of it, where you're looking at refuse or reimagine, doing something different. Don't buy it in the first place. So, and us as procurers, to have the biggest impact is for people not to procure, in one sense. So it's a bit of a tension there, but it is very powerful. So I think replacing one way of utilizing a service or a good with a greener way, or proving it's not needed at all. Like moving to simple one is I purchase envelopes, which is frustrating. There's car taxes delivered all through Ireland in the envelope. There's no way around it. There's always this envelope. So unless they come up with digital tax, but as soon as they make a change on that, I'm getting goodbye to envelopes completely. That's not my proudest solution. But anyway, on that note, I'll leave it on past that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Emma, you want to?
Sure. I think a few really interesting themes which came out in today's discussions that I'd like to touch on. One is about the challenge of coordination, both across levels of government, but also within, different sectors of government. And then the other theme I think is that I'll touch on is about the importance of eco-labels and standards in creating the kind of criteria we're using. So to the point about coordination mechanisms, I think one thing that's clear is the challenge of coordinating across different sectors and different levels of government. So the example that I think is important here is in the US, there's proposed rules around asking procuring firms from whom you procure to be disclosing both direct and indirect emissions. And yet in the same sort of breath, the US securities regulator is only sort of pushing its rules towards scope 1 and scope 2. So basically, not aligning the ambitions of procurement with the sort of signals that are being sent by other government entities to the market. And this speaks to this challenge of how do we balance the ambitions of procurement with the need to have a market there available to deliver, and trying to think about how governments need to speak with a unified voice to send these signals, similarly in a harmonized way. And then vertically, thinking about the different levels of government here as well, there's very few institutionalized mechanisms for coordinating different levels of government around these questions. And so you see competition, or you see a lack of harmony. Again, to the US, you have California pushing much farther on its disclosure regulations than the national government. And so, different signals being sent to firms again. So I think these are important challenges to think about when we try to understand how do we harmonize and most amplify the effect of procurement as a tool for achieving net zero or climate outcomes. And then the other one is the importance of eco-labels and standards. I think we're talking a lot about, when there's a real lack of capacity or understanding of, how to operationalize these issues, we really lean a lot on the standards and labels and certification systems which exist out there. And so I think we need to think a bit more systematically and comparatively across countries about which labels and standards are we using, which ones are we really converging around, where do we lack standards, or where are those standards actually not fit for purpose? Are they not actually sort of standardizing either good practice or standardizing the kinds of things that we hope they are standardizing when we're trying to achieve certain objectives? So I think here there's just a lot of there's a lack of research to really understand which labels, certification systems, and standards are actually most important in this space.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Skip.
Thank you. So many interesting topics that we touch on today, and it's kind of like hard to narrow down to 3 questions, but two things kind of like, draw my attention in terms of like how we're discussing in procurement policy and net zero goals. I think like one, like especially for some regions of the world, like obviously mostly working in Latin America, it's like one question is like, how do you even get started with this policy, right? Like, and what are the incentives, what are the entry points to actually develop a comprehensive procurement policy that people are going to be able to implement otherwise. And in addition to that, I think like this is something that is very relevant for the rest of the world, like even places that are fairly advanced in net zero emissions policies, is how do you measure progress? Like how do you actually have like a standardized way to making progress there? So just like a few thoughts on this, like how to get started and windows of opportunity. I think we work in a project. We have this program that it's called the Open Tech. I represent the Open Tech project. I didn't introduce myself for the folks that are joining online, but we have a program that it's a dedicated technical assistance program for 18 months. We call the Lift Impact Acceleration. And in one of those projects, we work with the state of Assam in India with a local partner that it's called Civic Data Labs. And the work that they did was really around looking into how flooding happened in India, right? Like, so they had annual floods, and most of the money wasn't really going to the places that needed the money, but it was more like on a first come, first served basis. But then like the allocation of resources didn't really help them have like build more resilient infrastructure. They developed a data model. This came up in the conversation today. How do you use non-procurement data to make procurement decisions? So they developed a data model that would actually like predict where the areas that were like most prone to having flooding and that were less prepared for it, like this advanced data model, and then they embedded that into the decision making and created an entire kind of like green budget around it. So that's one way to come in, because not only they're like better allocating the resources for like flooding right now, which is now like a 95% compliance rate, but in addition to that, they're using these to getting started with like how do you label the products and how do you move in that direction, right? Like, so I think that is one thing. And then the other thing on how do you measure progress, right? Like we've discussed the importance of having standardized data. I obviously talk a lot about it, like coming from OCP and like trying to get like open and standardized data. But it does feel like there's like a common topic of like governments not even like starting to even label on a contract by contract basis, like what is needed. There's many tools to do that, but like really following compliance, what are the incentives that you need for governments to start like really complying with this? Is it making it mandatory, and then like about the section someone say, well, maybe there should be a penalty if like people aren't like really using this, or is this about capacity building and having kind of like green flags and like really letting people know when there's like a specific contract that is like particularly good to follow green criteria, and then like just like given that nudge to do that. Or following the Dominican Republic approach, which is like giving prizes to people who are actually following it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. I think we've lost the next person I was hoping to speak, but Vera, can you go next?
Sorry? Yes,
Yeah.
yes, sure, of course. I'm gonna wrap up a little bit. The one thing was said today. I brought a little bit of information about the new Brazilian law on public procurement. And what I brought this morning is that we have been struggling to implement the new ideas about how to establish sustainable practices in public procurement. And what is now allowed in the new law is that you really can have the procurement process, considering the life cycle of the project, of the object. This is one thing. The second thing is that it's now allowed that you can seek the best cost benefit proposal, and it's very hard to do it. We don't have any cases at the moment. The third thing is that we can have what we call a margin of preference. That means that the government is allowed to pay up to 10% more when comparing to the cheapest offer in the bid if it has a specification with recyclable or biodegradable goods. And at the end, it's a big issue for us to incorporate provisions for variable remuneration linked to contractors' performance. And those are now allowed in our new law, and we are still working on how to implement those activities. That's what I brought this month.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. So I hope that's given our online audience a bit of a flavour of the discussions that we've been having. And what I'd like to do now is just open up for some questions and comments, which could be from our online audience or from colleagues in the room. Have we got anyone online with a question? Chris, hello.
Anne, how are you? And thanks very much for excusing me for being there. On terms of the solutions, the potential solutions, something that Tom Daly and I had talked about and Steve Skinner's worked on is in terms of rank ordering the various approaches like eco labels, for example, versus disqualifying contractors because they don't monitor their own greenhouse gas emissions. Is there any literature out there that folks are aware of that talks? There was an allusion before to the fact that the SEC has taken a step back on the greenhouse gas emission requirements. Is there any literature out there that talks about the relative cost of these solutions? Because it seems like the costs and the risks that surround the individual solutions are having an important effect on the willingness of countries to adopt these various environmental sustainability solutions.
That's a great question. Thank you very much. Is anybody feeling moved to tackle it?
Yeah, well, I would say there are a couple of articles floating around that is aimed to analyze the impacts, and I'm happy to share links with people. They are few and far between, I would say, and we could definitely do with a lot more, analysis of the impacts of green procurement overall, and then this specific question of can we compare different mechanisms. We did have a little bit of a discussion around the impact of different green procurement approaches on competition. And that, I think, is a really fertile area to look at, both in terms of raw numbers. So do we see an impact on raw numbers? Do we see particular impacts on, for example, small and medium-sized enterprises? And is there a sort of sweet spot or optimal level of competition that we want in order to achieve environmental objectives through procurement? Because it's not always the case that more competition is better if that means that each bidder is perhaps investing less because they only have a 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 chance of winning the contract. Whereas if they're 1 in 5, maybe they say, well, we will invest in certification or we will take steps to green our supply chain because we think we have quite a good chance of winning that contract. So I know others might be aware of more existing research. I have a few articles I can point to, but yeah, not a huge amount really, Chris, that I'm aware of.
Just a building on what you're saying, but an example of a competition we ran for office paper, and there's been a long history of only getting one bid for this competition. And I mentioned at the symposium, we switched from a choice between recycled and virgin pulp, and we just went for recycled only. Did the competition, we got 5 bids for the first time in years and years. So we're still trying to understand what happened there, but it seems to be, well, we're going to be talking to the suppliers because once you've given them bad news, they've lost and stuff, give them a bit of time to cool down. But the idea is you still engage with the suppliers and just say, well, what changed, what made it different, and would be open because they're relatively short contracts, so it would be with 18 months again. But there seems to be some attraction there where they felt they had better competitive edge against the incumbent because of, as you say, in the early days, but it's interesting to see.
It's a good example. Anybody else want to come in on that cost data evaluation also?
Yes, well, I mean, also on the point on competition, maybe this is interesting for Professor Chuck, is at OCP, we documented this case study of Lithuania, right, that I shared earlier too. But this like on how they applied green criteria, and the uptake was very high, just like a very small period of time, just like so from 2020 to 2023 for eligible procurement, eligible meaning like there's only like this, like it's reduced, like it's not the entire universe of public procurement in the country. The uptake went from 5% to 95%, so like very high, very short period of time. But then they also recognized that it was throwing down competition. I think 6% is the like, you know, how much it went down. So I think the interesting thing there, like what we're finding works not only there, but like in other places, is like having the granularity of data that we're like actually publishing this at the same time within, you know, like both what is the average number of bidders that they're getting when you're following green criteria? Like, does that make a difference? Like, I think like this is also for like costing, you know, framework agreements should be fairly simple to see, like, you know, like what are the changes that are bringing when you change from one item that's eco-labeled versus another one, and like what are the terms of cost. So not aware of any specific literature. That's something that we wrote as a case study. But I think like there might be something that it's worth digging there also to have like better reliability.
Just to come in with a question from the audience, one asks, can I invite reflections on any internal issues that may be understood as a limiting factor within local governments managing contractors over contract life cycles? From what I can gather, capability to manage service providers across project life cycle is a particular issue where staff turnover during periods of austerity is inevitable.
Great question. Anybody like to have a go at that? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, we've been talking quite a lot about local government capacity in different countries, in Brazil, in Czech Republic, which has very small local authorities, in the UK, where we've got the new city region model of American mayoral government coming in a big way, and now being completed for all the 9 city regions. Latest one is for Greater Newcastle, where there's a new mayor, Kim McGuinness, who's just been elected and has to bring together 7 local authorities, 5 metropolitan authorities and 2 very large counties, which is an immense task. And it's in the context of the decimation of local government through the financial cuts and the austerity that's taken place over the last 10 years. So it is very difficult because procurement capacity on the ground is very sparse. And one of our colleagues from the GLA has just left from the Greater London Authority. And I think he told me they've got 1,000 vacancies for procurement staff. And that's, you know, just across Greater London. So we're looking at these issues, and clearly the new combined authorities have got a tremendous job to do because they link planning and housing and transport, for example, and have got a key role in sustainable development. But they too, you know, it's not clear that they will have either the finance or capacity to tackle these issues, which are exceedingly complex.
Anyone else want to come in on that question about turnover and life cycle? No? Okay. Do we have any more questions from our online?
We have a comment from Steve Schooner. He says, to Chris's point, far too much of the cost analysis is short term, which is why the discussion about life cycle cost analysis or total cost of ownership, internalizing climate related externalities, etc., is so important. More broadly, it all comes back to Raworth and donut economics. If we continue to rely on conventional economic pathologies, worshiping growth, rather than reorientating government priorities, prioritizing quality of life, life expectancy, infant mortality, health, opportunity, etc., we face insurmountable hurdles.
Economics definitely got a name check today as well in the room. And just on the life cycle, we talked a bit about life cycle costing, so how does life cycle analysis to a lesser extent. And one of the interesting developments that those of us who work in the European space have our eye on is under the new Energy Efficiency Directive, that member states are required to look at their budgetary practices in order to remove barriers to life cycle costing. So I think there's some really interesting comparative discussions to be had over the next year or so, which is the timeline for implementing that directive around how you do that in practice. Because I think as many people acknowledge, we all support life cycle thinking in theory, but when it comes to actually applying it in the context of a public body's budget, it's not always so easy.
Christopher says he has a comment about eco labels. If you want to talk about that.
Yeah, just a couple of comparative models on the eco labels, because we talked, there was comment before about the problem is the eco labels don't match. For example, they don't match across the Atlantic. In the cybersecurity areas, the United States has a real weakness that we use our own standards. We use the National Institute of Standards and Technology cybersecurity standards. And the Defense Department has recognized that, and will, for non-classified procurements, will allow the contractor, let's say Swedish or British contractor, to approach the CIO at the Defense Department and say, look, my cybersecurity standards are just as good as your NIST standards once you accept my product. And the CIO is allowed to do that. So that's one way, a first step way to deal with differences in eco labels, which would be allow the procuring entity to consider whether or not these, in fact, the standards are practically the same. The second is we have a process internally in the Defense Department where if the Defense Department decides that a product is a commercial item, which has profound ramifications for how it's treated from a regulatory standpoint, then across the department, it will be treated as a commercial item, likely across the US government, likely. And so the idea would be that once you get past that first threshold, you've proven that your eco label is just as good as the eco label that's being used in the United States. The Swedish eco label is the same as the American eco label. Then that could be published. And once you've turned that corner, once you've taken that second step, really what you begin to see is that eco labels are a form of qualification. They really are a species of qualification. And then that means that all that we're doing around the world to share qualification information more effectively, more efficiently, eco-label slides into that. So instead of it being a battle about using uniform eco-labels, it becomes a success in sharing qualification information.
Interesting, thank you.
There's one more comment from Steve Schooner, also about eco labels. He says, I also hope we don't fall into the trap of either or, with focus on, say, eco labels versus focusing on services, etc. We need to advocate for all of the above. It's the classic all hands on deck situation / challenge. For example, eco labels don't really help with rethinking our requirements, focusing on what to buy as opposed to how. Give me a second here. There was a new chat. Investing in public transport, then replacing fossil fuel vehicles with an equivalent number of EVs, etc. There are dramatic potential gains in infrastructure and construction with LEED, embodied carbon, green / planted roofs, etc. Again, let's not fall into the trap of either or. We have a question. We can all mull on that. Another question here. How could you suggest such policies be tailored to address the unique socioeconomic challenges in the global south, especially Africa, to ensure both environmental sustainability and economic inclusivity?
That's a great question. Any of you like to comment on that? Yes, please do.
I've been working a bit in Africa, and actually there are several different experiences. It's true that we tend to see the continent as a whole, but then there are different experiences depending also on the region. And there are both social and environmental considerations that are taken into account. More often, the social aspects are the ones that are taken into account in the procurement process. But I know that they are also doing some efforts in taking into account the green aspects. Right now, they are more on waste management, which is a real issue in Africa, not only in Africa, but especially there. So that's the main focus, at least in West Africa, where I was working.
Can I just, yeah, I just want to come in on the discussion around eco labels, because I think a lot of, fantastic points were made and great examples there. I think one thing I just want to pick up on, is this point, which is so key, which is that eco labels don't tell us what to buy. And I think this is really, I think, important to underscore. When, we're all trying to figure out what it means to do net zero or climate aligned procurement, we need to be cautioning procurement officials that eco labels are not, should not define priorities, that what comes prior to the question of procurement is actually a set of policy discussions about, what should we be procuring. So the example we used today, which I thought was great, was, what does net zero aligned procurement look like when you're building a road? Is the procurement in the materials? Is the procurement in the firm? Does it have to sort of demonstrate certain qualifications? But I think there's another higher level question here, which again speaks to procurement sits within a policy context, which is, should, prior to that procurement conversation, should there have been a conversation about, the urban design? Is the road the right choice here? And how do we align our government actions in general, and then sort of use that to tee up procurement in a much more precise way? Because I think there's a risk that we disconnect the procurement conversation and don't plug it well enough into the policy process. And then we rely on these standards to say, this is aligned, but what is it aligned with? It's aligned with the standard, but there's no sense to which that's actually aligned with internal policy priorities or targets. And it's figuring out how to slot those, or how to bring those things together, which I think is quite critical. I think somebody phrased it as, thinking about value or values. And I think there's a question about values, which is not answered by the labels and certifications. The values question has to come through strong engagement between the policy priority questions, the high level targets, and then the spending practices themselves.
Fantastic, thank you. Good point, well made, I think. Barry, did you have a question?
Yeah, so some of the conversation today was about data. Some of the conversation today was about the capacity issues around using data. It's easy to get depressed about some of this stuff. We got the elaborate targets, and we're also hearing from some practitioners that it's really difficult to do anything with this. I wanted to ask the panel if they have seen exciting or promising examples of using procurement data to actually make a strategic decision or do some of the thinking that Emma's just described. Other examples that you've seen, what does that look like? What does strategic public procurement look like if it's informed with procurement data?
You would like to have a go at that one? Nice challenging question. Yes.
I think we have like multiple examples, obviously, and we've discussed some of those today, and I get particularly excited about like those places that are just like building, as I was describing before, like how do you even get started with this, right? Like, and so the example of the Dominican Republic, I think it's a good one, right? Like, because it's a country that has done a lot over the past 4 years, both in terms of anti-corruption and then like actually like moving in the direction of implementing a new policy. And what I think what they've done right is they've started with like, how do you first design a policy that is user friendly in the sense that like people roughly know when they can select a procurement, right? Like, because they've done through CPV and like other mechanisms, they've like have like already said like these are kind of like the items that would be most amenable for you to use like your procurement, right? Like they also have assistance in terms of like just like choosing the right technical requirements and doing that kind of work. And they've used that, right? Like, not only to train public officials in how to implement it, but also they are very hands-on in terms of like saying, like, is the way that like the green criteria being used in this procurement the right way? And if so, we're going to accept it. And then they also have a dashboard, right? Like, so it's not only for like, the procurement agency, central procurement agency to be monitoring like all of different procurement entities, but like the citizens can go there and like can look like, what's the level of adoption, what's happening in, my jurisdiction, is this like going in the right direction or not? And all of that through like a public dashboard that is looking into like different things. The other good example that I already quoted is Lithuania. I think like Lithuania is very good. I already discussed like how they did like, like this eligibility, of procurement, then like green criteria and then like really manage the uptake. But what they're doing right now is even more exciting because they're actually looking at outcomes, right? Like if you think about, green criteria, whether it follows or not, like that is to some extent, compliance with, right? Like because you did it, you have it then, but like you don't know what's going to happen with that, right? Like right now, you're looking again, like prioritizing using carbon calculators and looking, and they're getting results, I think, across 4 categories of spending, where they're actually seeing that this is really helping, like move the needle in terms of like carbon emissions. And the example from Assam that I also guess like I think like that one's also worth looking at. And there's a case study written up about this because what they've done with the green budget that came after, like this disaster relief model where they're like allocating the money to the right places, right? That they're actually looking into categories that they have like 2 billion US dollars. Can't remember how much that's in rupees, but they have like a large, like budget right now within Assam that is only devoted to procurement. And it's like selecting the priority categories of spending of what they need to do, labeling that, and then like publishing that in the OCDS, like have like really helps. And I think like that is kind of like another place where people should be looking at. And it's all really about I think matching the right incentives, like whether like just like for people to start like using data, but then like also how do we create like more and more incentives for people to be making the right decisions at the right moment. And I think like that is kind of some of the examples that get me particularly excited.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for cheering us up. Malcolm, you wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you very much. I am unmuted. Yes. Sorry, I was trying to come in earlier, but I was grappling with a different terminal. I spent a day last week at the Sapiens Network Conference. I don't know how many of you know about Sapiens, but it's a very big European community network with a lot of early career researchers working on strategic procurement in low carbon solutions. And the impression I came away from that, and more generally with my work that we're doing in our own Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre, is that we have to be extremely cautious about thinking that there are any simple solutions. I mean, there's an immense complexity involved in every procurement contract to do with delivering some sort of zero carbon solution. But I mean, the core of it is that we have to change the way we think about public procurement. And some of you would have heard me say this many times before. We have to change the way we think about it as a really powerful enabling tool to actually deliver zero carbon solutions. We've spent a lot of time in the UK reforming our existing rules, but actually it's how we apply them that's really going to be the important thing. And I think I was pleased that local authorities were giving a mention earlier, because I think that cities and local authorities generally have a really crucial role to play here. And governments need to be spending far more time in giving them those enabling solutions. And secondly, they need to be given more support in thinking about some of the ways they're going to do that. Now, competition was mentioned earlier, and just a quick sample of the sort of challenges. We did some work with Oxfordshire County Council, Oxfordshire City Council on a sort of exploratory basis about a year ago about how to allocate contracts for providing residential charging points and doing it on a basis where there could be more local control and more local companies doing that, because they didn't want to allocate it to large energy suppliers because they felt that would be pushing prices up and giving them more control. Now, that's actually quite a difficult thing to do. And in a way, there's a bit of a replica there about dealing with upgrading existing housing, particularly housing that's relatively old, where you want to, and the best people to do that in many cases are small, local, well-trained people. And there are people looking at mechanisms, particularly, and this, I think this is applicable in the developing world as well, of upgrading skills and providing skills for people to actually go and upgrade properties as part of an overall delivery contract. And if you like, it's a combination of services, technology and training that are going to be able to do that. So, I mean, I think there's a whole lot of very exciting solutions around, but I'm not sure that we are really, we're spending a lot of time thinking about the legal framework, but we're not actually thinking about how to deliver and use it effectively.
Emma, do you want to respond?
Yeah, no, I think I'm really happy you brought up the local government point, because I think, as you say, it's a huge opportunity, and I think it's an underappreciated one. But it's also a big challenge given the constraints that many local governments are facing. And to the point about capacity, and going back to the earlier questions about turnover, one thing you often hear in research is the importance of having a sustainability team or a sustainability lead, and you know, increasingly piling on the roles that person will have to play as a sort of coordinating individual. And I've come to be quite possibly cynical about this, because I think what you often see in practice is that kind of a team often gets isolated and has to go around knocking on doors and, you know, bothering everybody. And I think the challenge is actually how to make these issues everybody's business without making it one person's business to, you know, ensure or to provide oversight. And I think there's an interesting movement here to talk about something called climate budgeting in cities. So the idea being that actually all with it, you know, there's a sort of overall carbon emissions budget given to a city, and within that, all actions have to be sort of assigned a carbon value. So in the same way that you have a fiscal budget, you would also then have to have a carbon budget, which, you know, all people would have to sort of operate within and under. And this being a means, and a sort of means to institutionalize and mainstream the question to all people. So rather than making it one person's business to play this huge championing role, in fact, what you do is try to institutionalize this other.
Yeah. I mean, I understand your direction of travel, but frankly, I think this is too complicated within the organization, you know, because by the time people have actually worked out what their carbon budgets are, I mean, basically they want to go out and do stuff. And I come back to the housing point. I mean, there are so many different scales of projects that you can allocate people to, but certainly the local authorities doing it well do have someone in their housing team who is looking after decarbonising housing at every scale, and also commercial buildings. I mean, another council I went to is Essex, I think, have got a big project actually improving the environmental performance of their own estate. You know, I mean, that's something that most councils own a lot of buildings, which are all carbon sinks, or could be.
Thank you. Okay, so we're drawing to the end of our time, and I want to give the panel an opportunity just to kind of come back in on any of the discussion. We've had a couple more questions in the chat just to flag those up. So one question: how effective are auditing bodies in influencing procurement processes at national and local levels? So it's directed at Oscar, in fact, but Andre, you may want to comment on that too, because I know that you're interested in that. And then there's also a question about, could there be an opportunity for a kind of transatlantic mutual recognition agreement on the use of eco labels, which is an interesting idea. Let's just go back around the panel. You can address those questions. You can address different questions. You can sum up as you prefer. So a couple of minutes each. So we'll go in the same order. Andre, is there anything you would like to say?
I think the auditing has a strong role to influence the process, but could be not just pushing the municipalities or local governments in order to impose penalties, but also training and helping them to understand and reducing the shared uncertainty. Not necessarily penalizing the government, but also create opportunities to mutual understanding there. Thank you.
If I can make a comment on this?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's a risk on that, and I do agree with Ingrid, but there is a great risk on the public audits, the public, the auditors, the auditor bodies start to be public administration instead of being controllers. Because as the public administration is always super afraid of the control bodies, they open space a lot for them to design the public policy for them. And this is a huge risk if from the public administration, we do not have good capacity to dialogue, because we're gonna have to be completely destroyed by the control bodies.
Thank you. Andy, any last reflections from you?
Yeah, just briefly on eco labels, like I mean, when we specify eco labels in our procurement, we as in Ireland, we always have our equivalent at the end, and that's kind of the catch-all from a procurement law perspective to say that we're not it's going to be equal treatment, etc. The problem we have with that is, though, and it probably shows why it'd be important to have more international agreements, is that how do you know if it's the equivalent? Does the procurer have the expertise to say, well, eco label X is the same as eco label A? From a different jurisdiction, it could be from anywhere in the world. So that is a problem. It hasn't manifested itself, and maybe it's being overcautious, but it's a thing that we put in. Most of the procurements I've seen have always been just the European ones that come through anyway. But for suppliers looking at it, they can bid for it if they've got the money. What happens to prove it is another question.
Thank you. Emma, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, just also a quick point on eco labels, which is to say, I think we are seeing a lot of sort of self-organizing in some areas of label standards, sort of an incentive to harmonize without a need for any sort of orchestration of that from government. So those are usually around maybe more procedural standards like disclosure, where a lot of governments are seeing, and a lot of actors themselves are seeing the incentive to just use the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures guidelines. And so in that space, you know, I think it's very easy to see that there's convergence happening, where I think something like a transatlantic mutual recognition agreement, where there is scope for that, is on these more substantive questions where the incentives really vary widely. And I think there would be scope for much more sort of hands-on organizing of that space, because I don't think the incentives are there at the firm level to do it themselves. So yeah, I think in certain areas there would certainly be scope for this.
So one thing on that question about mutual recognition. So we used to have that between the US and the EU on Energy Star, and that agreement was not renewed during the Trump administration. So in a way, we've taken a step backwards in that regard. And what we have now in that space, in the ICT space, is we have in Europe, the most common ones now would be EPEAT and TCO certified that get referred to. On the question of equivalence, I think it's quite important to understand that equivalence doesn't mean they're the same or identical, because it's also quite healthy to have competition between eco labels so that they continue to be robust and develop. But yeah, certainly some form of mutual recognition would be useful.
Steve's comment in the chat, thank you. Oscar, any final thoughts from you?
Yes, well, so on the question of auditing institutions, so we discussed today a lot of, you know, what's the role of auditing institutions, so much like in places that are for procurement officials, which is, you know, tends to be most of the world, not everywhere, but like tend to be very risk averse. Obviously, auditing can become liability to have to be able to implement procurement policies. We discussed at length, you know, the case of Latin America, Brazil, of you have, you know, these criteria that you want to apply but are vaguely defined. And then, you know, this happened a lot in Colombia, for example, with the food procurement policy. You were supposed to source locally the food that you were buying, but then it was hard to justify if you were going to be audited, or like if any control institution was going to come after the contract was awarded to kind of like explain me why you chose this vendor over another one if this wasn't, you know, clearly laid out in the criteria, or like, are you going beyond like what the procurement law allows you to do, right? Like, so I think like there's obviously that bad incentive, but I think there's some room, right? Like for auditing institutions to have a say in even guiding that, right? Like, so, for example, in Brazil right now, there's like greater availability of medicine procurement data at the local level, right? Like, so this is not green procurement policy, but like what the Tribunal de Cuentas de la Unión, these like the auditing institutions, like it's kind of like in the US, the Yale, they're taking a more like preventive approach, right? Like where they're also telling the people like in advance before they get audited, like what is a reference price that could serve like whatever procurement they're making. And you could think of like similar approaches to green procurement, where auditing becomes more preventive, even if it's just on an informational basis, doesn't really clear you, right? Like, but it at least gives confidence to the procurement official of what that they're doing is not. And also it came up today, and I really like this idea of incentives for professionalization. How can you advance people's careers if they're using like, like green criteria and green procurement policy? And then just like one final thought on, fitting green procurement policies within greater public policy, right? And that's why I like so much the project we did with Mexico City. Mexico City major, like not a political statement, but she is a climate scientist, was a climate scientist, had it in her agenda to really build a greener city. And then we built this public bike share system. We expanded it to double and like reduced the price that people were paying, made it more accessible. Why? Because because like that specific project was going to meet any specific carbon emissions goals, but because the city in itself was trying to build green infrastructure, and that's how it built. And I think that comes to the question of like, do we need this road or not? Like that, like how do you build like specific strategic procurements for that?
Thank you. Vera, have you got any concluding thoughts?
Well, actually, I was really impressed this morning because we brought so many good information about green procurement, especially about the professionalization of the public administration in terms of getting more upward, in terms of getting more better, in terms of being, okay, I rephrase it. The thing is that as we don't have a career for public services, for public procurement service, civil servants in Brazil, we don't have a specific career. And this topic that my colleague just mentioned about having specific incentives is super important. And that has really something to do about the auditing control and auditing bodies to bring the public administration to the center of this, the design thinking of this. This is, even though this is very important to have public auditing and to have universities and school of governments and all of that, they do have to be the center of the decisions. And there's one other point there. In Brazil, we do have, we call it cargo em comissão. I don't know how to say that in English. They are not civil servants as a career. They are appointed. And we have lots of those public servants that are appointed, but they are from the civil society and they are appointed for one specific type of activity. And we have many of them that go off the public administration and all the information that they gather. And this is a huge problem because we need to retain good information within the public sectors.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much to all of our speakers in the room, for the people who've been at the workshop today. Thank you to our online audience as well for your contributions and your participation. It's been lovely to have your involvement too, for the questions and for the comments in the chat. I think where I end up at the end of this is that this is all hard and complicated, but it is one of the biggest challenges we all face, if not the biggest. And so we've just got to take a deep breath and get on with it, as someone very memorably put it earlier in the day. So that's our challenge. Pogo will now take a break over the summer. We will be back in September once we've digested all of this. And we will be refreshed and reinvigorated, ready to grapple with some of these problems again, along with a new Procurement Act in the UK. So I hope to see you all in September, back in our little squares for that. So thank you all very much indeed. It's been a great day.